Diane Hoskins, an architect and self-described Lego fanatic. Born and raised in Chicago, Hoskins graduated from MIT and earned an MBA from UCLA. Today, she's one of the world's most powerful leaders in architecture and design, named global co-chair of Gensler in 2023, following nearly 20 years as co-CEO. Growing Gensler into a leader in sustainable design, from office buildings to airports. Diane Hoskins is in the Changemakers spotlight. Diane, thank you so much for being here with us today. You were named a 2025 CNBC Changemaker because of your career growing Gensler into the leader in sustainable design and building practices. What led you to see architecture as a kind of force for social good and change?
Well, Julia, it's so good to be here with you, and it's an honor to be named by CNBC among such amazing women. You know, architecture is, we think of it as buildings, as fairly static, as, a benign part of the lives we live. And in actuality, those buildings can actually shape and do shape our lives. How a city is laid out, we know. We're sitting here in Los Angeles. It's a very different experience than sitting in New York, the way New York is designed, or Chicago, or Paris. And just those, factors start to determine where we live and how close we live to things and what it's like to walk on the streets and what all those experiences are. And then you take it to the building level, and it's the same thing, how we feel about being next to buildings that are beautiful, or a building that is a bit off-putting or feels like, oh, don't come here, or another that says, you're welcome to be part of, this experience. And so design really does have an impact in our lives. And, that has been something that frankly brought me into architecture in the first place, even as a young child. And I loved playing with Legos, building the Barbie houses, all the above. And I'm from Chicago, so, waking up, seeing the beautiful skyscrapers and the incredible buildings, and the great history of architecture in Chicago is something everyone in the city is, familiar with and proud of. So you're kind of tuned into architecture and the built environment just being there.
So when you were building Legos at a young age, or building the Barbie dream house, did you know you wanted to be an architect then?
It led me to want to be an architect, and to love just building things. It just really became something that was a drive that just felt right. I didn't know at that time, you needed to probably know, math and have some kind of drawing skills or other kind of skill sets that are good in the profession. I really was thinking about, I like buildings. I like building things. I enjoy, making stuff. I made a model of our house out of Legos, My brother would get something like, a race car set or something to put that would, you'd have to put together with a lot of instructions. He had no patience, so after about an hour, he was off doing something else, playing football with his friends, and I'd be sitting there in the basement putting together his whatever it was, just because I love just putting things together and building things. And so I think it was kind of a bit of nature inside of me, and then a bit of nurture from my mom and the things around me. And, I always said that's what I wanted to be, and when it came time to, go to college, I selected the school that I went to because it was one of the top schools of architecture, and it kind of started to lead me down a path.
You've described your passion for architecture, the art of it, and this intrinsic feeling you had of always wanting to build and design things. But you're running a business, and you've been running Gensler for decades. There are people who can run any sort of business, and then there are people who are truly passionate about a particular product or process. How does your passion for architecture shape your approach to the business part of it?
It's a great question. And I actually believe being an architect has shaped my leadership style. I guess that's expected. but maybe in ways that are a little different from other areas of focus and how they might influence your ability to lead. You know, leadership today is very much about people. It's about vision, it's about strategy. And, you know, as an architect, the first and foremost it's a people business. And, you know, as much as it's about these places, it's about understanding how people use those places and how people are influenced by those places. And to achieve any kind of architecture, I mean, from day one, I was part of a team. You know, the first job I ever had, which actually was right across the street here, I was part of a team of people that, you know, all had different roles, and we were working on a project together. There was a schedule, there were, you know, milestone dates, there was a client, there was clearly a budget, and all of these kind of parameters around it. And it was how that team came together to achieve the design, the budget, the schedule, and making that client happy. That was going to be how we created success. And, you know, fast forward, that's really how you create success in business today. It's about a team. It's about bringing a team together, maximizing the people on that team, understanding and having a vision for what it is that you're trying to achieve. That's that, you know, again, you could say in design, it's the design vision. As a company, it's that bigger vision of what you do and your purpose. And then the strategy, how are you going to get there? When you're doing, you know, architecture and design, it's complicated. There are thousands and thousands of inputs, decisions that are made, you know, with your client, decisions that are made because of the building codes, decisions that are made because of the context of where that building is, availability of materials, you know, standards of practice. All of these things layer into the decisions that you need to make as a team and as individuals, and the accountabilities. And again, that starts to play out as you scale that up into thinking about being a business and how you are, frankly, needing to more and more today do all of that faster and faster. And that takes strategy. What comes first? What comes next? What are the interdependencies? What, you know, how do you present information to your clients so that you can get to the yes? How do you get 5 steps ahead and also bring a team along in a way that is going to create those results that you're looking for? You know, in many ways, designing, and especially in the business of design, it is what all businesses are now doing. Innovation is core to what we do as architects. It's creative. It's a creative practice. You don't know when you start really what you are creating until you're finished. Today in business, you can't run it on yesterday's premise. Innovation is a thread in every single business enterprise today. It has to be something the leaders understand and are comfortable with. And frankly, that they, you know, that it's part of who they are. And so that sense of innovation, creativity, again, in a framework of budget, schedule, team, people, maximizing people, growing the organization, are all, you know, skills I learned being an architect.
Mm-hmm. I'm also curious how your leadership style and how you've been impacted by your nonlinear path and setbacks. You landed a dream job at an architecture firm, and then it didn't work out, and you found yourself working at a perfume counter in Chicago. What did that initial setback teach you?
Yeah, it's, you know, that's so funny. I told that story at the MIT commencement last year, really to help the students understand that, you know, when you're in college, you have this vision of what is the ideal architecture experience, and you kind of buy into this mythology of, I'm going to go work in the office of, you know, fill in the blank architect that, you know, you believe is sort of this epitome of what an architect is, this sort of individual. And, you know, I went to work for one of those architects and just found it to be not creative, you know, basically all about that person and what they wanted, and not anything about the ideas of anyone else on the team. And I was like, I didn't want to do this. I'm not going to live my career as the support cast of someone else's vision. And, I left that job. I moved back to my, home in Chicago, my family's home in Chicago. And literally just to kind of get a job, I went to work in a department store at the, Marshall Field's perfume counter, which, is so different. Again, I graduated from MIT and here I am. And, at the end of the day, I felt extraordinarily just independent and satisfied with that decision, because it was about saying no to something I knew was not right for me, even though it might have checked a lot of boxes in the, what, kids in college think is the right job path. And I ended up working, and I feel just incredibly, just fortunate that one day one of my, former classmates actually was in the store, and we were chatting. She's like, I just got a job at this, great firm, and you should apply, and so on, which I did, and landed a great job there. And it was a huge firm, one of the largest firms at that time. And exactly the opposite of the kind of firm that I thought was going to be my ideal. And I loved it. I loved the scale of the projects, tall towers. I loved the scale of the office. There were hundreds of people. There was so much energy. There was, your ideas mattered. And again, this idea of working on these very complicated, interesting teams with a diversity of people. There were people there from all different countries. And it really did begin to set my career path toward, again, much more robust work, much more ambitious work, work that definitely required a team, but it wasn't, in this sort of service of a particular architecture ego that was at the center of the pyramid that one thinks about as, oh, that's what architecture is. Mm-hmm. It was this new model of architecture and design that really caused me to become extraordinarily excited about the profession in a new way.
Beyond that experience of listening to yourself, being willing to take a step off the path to find a better one, was there something you learned from just simply the experience of working in a different industry, from taking a break from architecture?
Absolutely, and actually, I hadn't thought about it that way, but one, I love perfume still. But more than that, and I did the same thing again after working in that firm and realizing, the sort of much more exposure to clients, and I'm like, wow, I want to learn who these clients are, what is driving kind of the need for the building, and maybe go into real estate development, which most of the clients were developers. So I actually left the profession, and again, which you're making me realize I did it once, I did it again, and maybe that first time was part of that, courage to follow the inner path rather than the expectations of, others. And I went and got my MBA and, decided to learn about real estate, learn about business. Found just, again, really exciting exposure to things like strategy, reading Competitive Advantage, Michael Porter and Peter Drucker, and, just deep thinking about how business works. Mm-hmm. You don't realize, just like with architecture, people don't realize there's process, there's overlays of thinking about how we get to those outcomes. And it's the same thing in business, and I realized I had a real interest and aptitude for it as well.
Would you recommend that young people take a nonlinear path and not just stay on that one road? For you would have been just architecture, to diversify their experiences?
Absolutely. I especially today where I would say solutions need to be informed by more than one discipline. I frankly think most people who are in our tech companies would benefit from having been in other domains before entering whatever name the flavor of tech company, so that they're bringing more perspective into these tools that are so leveraged across our daily lives. I think it's true in all of, I would say the same thing for doctors. I'd say the same thing for, any of us, and many people, just by the virtue of their career path, have that where they've tried different things. And you find that the success that they're having, is often because they are not coming at it from, a single set of ideas, but are bringing a more holistic way of thinking.
You mentioned, getting off the initial career path in these different ways, but was there a setback in the world of architecture, a building that didn't turn out the way you wanted to, or some specific failure in your career that helped shape you?
I can't really point to particular failures, but the external environment, serves us many crises. I really just was getting into my career, and the S&L crisis was happening. In fact, in my first leadership role of an architecture office, it was, during the 1990s, and really a pretty, bad situation from the standpoint of interest rates and inflation and unemployment, and frankly, pretty devastating to the real estate and built environment industry. And so I would say that, it was not a time where you were going to get the big project and be able to do fabulous design, in the way we all think about design. It was a time where I learned how to find work, how to make projects happen through persistence, how to be super competitive. Lots of architectural work is awarded through RFPs, or requests for proposal. And, going in and playing to win, because, your whole business is on the line on that win. And kind of like, you have to be in this, like, no other option is possible. We're going to win this. How do we do that if that's the case?
A key defining element of your career has been collaboration. You mentioned the teamwork earlier, but I think it's important to note that unlike most other firms, you and Andy Cohen were named co-CEOs and shared strategy and operations for 2 decades. Now you're chairman. How did that co-CEO model work? And what can others learn from it? It's still a pretty unusual model.
It is, and it's so funny. Andy and I even were asked to speak at a business school class to talk about co-leadership, co-CEO role, and how does it work? Because it is a bit of the antithesis of the CEO ethos, which is kind of the commander at the top and the pyramid and all of that kind of thinking. Honestly, we believe strongly in collaborative leadership at our firm, and it's not only at the CEO level. Again, we are co-chairs right now, but in every leadership role within our firm, it's a co. And we have 10 regions. Every region is led by 2 people. Every domain of our work, which we call practice areas, are led by co-leaders. We believe in collaboration at that team level and as leaders.
Sticking with collaboration, but in the workplaces that you are building for your clients, they're designed to drive productivity and collaboration for your clients. How do you think now, in this post-COVID, back to the office world, about creating spaces that foster productivity, especially when so many workers are still reluctant to come back to the office?
Wow, that is like the question of the day, right? Today, what we're finding is that people want to be in the workplace because they do see those benefits, but that employers have to up the game and make the investment in the kind of spaces that allow for the range of things that do maximize people. They need to be able to focus. And what that means in many ways is there have to be quiet areas, and we're now designing kind of quiet zones that are almost library-esque and quite strongly saying through the design that this is about individual work, this is about quiet, this is about focus. And then zones where it's more mixed, where you have teaming areas and individual work areas as well, where people are able to have those collaborative moments, but also a more active environment, which again, there are people who that maximizes them to have that level. And then, different kinds of, whether you call it phone booths or individual kinds of quiet spaces or two-person conferencing areas and smaller conferencing areas, 5-6 person conferencing areas, not just the one large conference room and then nothing else as we used to see in most offices. And what has also happened is that buildings are investing in amenity spaces that are available to the tenants in the building. So where we're seeing the design of workplaces themselves being brought to this new way of thinking, the buildings now also, if they are competing for those tenants, and they are, that tenants are now expecting that the building is offering those larger conferencing spaces, those cafe spaces, even those fitness areas as well, that there's a whole suite of amenities that are now the table stakes for the premium buildings that are frankly the buildings that are getting tenants moving in, because they do bring more to I'm leasing this space, but I also get more to support my people and my organization.
One of the fascinating challenges of your business is that you are working on projects that are going to take years to complete and are designed to last for decades or even for centuries. How do you think about balancing near-term volatility, factors like regulatory environments or tariff concerns, with the importance of keeping your eye on long-term planning?
That is the challenge of architecture, and it's probably one of the most important challenges for us to embrace more strongly. We talk about, let's look at our cities today. For a whole host of reasons, the back to work strategy issue is one of the reasons, but we have a lot of empty office buildings right now. Many of those buildings, and we created an algorithm to be able to test those buildings to see if they would be able to be transformed into a residential building. We have a housing crisis in many of our cities. So you have this empty office building, could it become a residential building? About 25% of the empty buildings that we've studied, and we've studied thousands of buildings across the US, we're doing a lot in New York right now and many other cities as well. So about 25% of buildings we're finding do have that ability to adapt.
So thinking about being adaptable in general.
Exactly. And that's kind of the point, is that we build to a market today when in reality these buildings are going to be around for 100 years. So how do we build with that in mind, that we test our buildings for different uses, that we don't over-optimize on one use, which is frankly what most buildings are, is just absolutely the perfect office building or the perfect residential building. We're seeing some of these buildings possibly being transitioned into data centers or some other kinds of uses, educational buildings. That's the long view. And to your point about, how economic crises can impact this is exactly the challenge. Well, I want to have every dollar going toward a return that I'm going to be able to measure against the optimum office building. So that additional width, that additional floor to ceiling height, or designing that core so that it can adapt, it costs money. And you want to squeeze that out if you're a developer doing what is expected of you as a REIT, right? So that long view has a cost associated with it. That long view, let's talk about the environment. Maybe today is fine, but 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now, it makes a huge difference. And so designing a building that is able to be electrified, that has the kind of systems that are able either today to operate at net zero or where there's a pathway to get to net zero. Those are the kinds of things we're thinking about. And I think all architects are starting to realize that that long view is important, I do believe that owners are starting to think that way, but there's a lot of pressure on building owners today, and hopefully we can help them see that future.
Investing in adaptability and flexibility. I'm going to end on two pieces of advice I'm going to ask of you. One is on following on this conversation about all the different factors swirling around right now. What is your advice to people who might feel overwhelmed with the amount of change and volatility, whether it's around environmental risks or regulatory restrictions? How can people stay focused on the long term right now? What's your advice?
I think my advice is to follow core values. I really feel like when all is said and done that obviously one has to be appropriate in terms of, the cost benefit of any decision. But doing what you believe is the right thing, that you can stand up and say, everything I knew today, and I made this decision based on everything I knew today, and I made a decision to do something that was going to have a benefit at the, as a generative decision. I think you can sleep well at night having made those kinds of decisions. I think trying to, overly hedge, and bet on something where it's not really based on something you know today, I think that's where you get into trouble.
That's where you go off track. And just a final question, is there something you know now that you wish you had known earlier in your career?
Wow, great question. I guess the fact that it goes so fast is hard, to really, you can't get back those years. And I think, we all can kind of think about, would have done, could have done. But the fact that your career goes really quickly, and to make the most of it, to make those tough decisions, to be willing to take some risk, again, for the right reasons. I think risk for the right reason isn't risk. It's, really doing things that are pushing in that positive direction. And, those outcomes may not be what you believe they're going to be in the short run, but I really believe, and I could talk for hours about how in the long run, those decisions always end up being positive.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us here today
Julia.
and sharing
Great
your perspective.
Thank you
so much.